I guess we all like to be told when we're doing a good job, whether it's in our work, whether it's raising our families, or just trying to get into shape. When we put our heart and soul into something, it's really important to know that we're getting somewhere. Conservation organizations are no different. They invest large amounts of time and resources into trying to save endangered species and threatened landscapes. And they and the people that support them, people like you and me, want to know that they're actually making a difference. But how do you really know? If you're running a business, it may just be a question of how much profit you make by the end of the year. Or if you're training to run a marathon, how many miles you can run in a certain period of time. But in the world of conservation, it's not quite so straightforward. One of the most popular tools that people use is something called indicators. That is, you take your project goals and objectives, and you measure those things that indicate how close you are to achieving those goals. So let's take one of my favorite examples, elephants. Let's say your project objective is to ensure that you have a viable population of elephants. So in year 1, you have 20 ellies. In year 5, you have 30. So that's a 50% increase. Sounds like you're on the right track. Pretty simple, right? Actually, it's not quite that easy. For a start, although you wouldn't think so given their size, elephants are actually quite difficult to count. The little beggars are really good at hiding behind trees. But more importantly, what I've learned from working in conservation is it's not about elephants anyway. At its most basic, conservation is about people. After all, if you just leave nature to its own devices, it just gets on with it, it just does its own thing. It's when you throw people into the mix that the problems begin. How they interact with the environment, the choices they make. And people are a lot harder to quantify. Unlike elephants, it's not so much about numbers as it is about attitudes and beliefs. Because ultimately, that's what drives people's behavior. Conservationists struggle with these kinds of indicators. It's one thing to measure a change in the population of elephants. It's another thing to measure a change in attitudes or levels of awareness. Take another example. Let's say your data shows that in the previous year there was actually a decrease in poaching. Now, the big question is that because of the efforts you've made to educate people that they're now more aware of the environment? Is it because your anti-poaching patrols are becoming more effective? Or is it simply because there are a lot less animals left to be poached? It's really important that we're able to answer these questions, because only then can we know where to focus the limited resources that we have at our disposal. So maybe we need to think of some other kinds of indicators, perhaps less traditional ones that will give us a more accurate picture of what is really going on. In 2011, I was asked to help set up a new project in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The objective of this project was to begin supporting the restoration of what is, in essence, a forgotten park in the southeastern corner of this vast and deeply troubled country. Very few people here have probably heard of Pemba National Park, but Pemba, it turns out, is one of the oldest parks in Africa. In fact, it's one of the oldest in the world. And at the time of its founding, it was considered to be one of the most biodiverse places on the continent. Yet what we found when we arrived there was truly shocking. A 10,000 square mile landscape, almost totally devoid of animals. The chief ranger station, the park headquarters in Lusinga, had in its time been a prime tourist destination. Now it was almost completely in ruins. Yet the rangers lived there with their families in what can only be described as abject poverty. The ranger force was a total mess. Their vehicles were scrap metal. Their patrol equipment was completely worn out or had long been stolen. And very few of the rangers were ever paid. And the few that were had a large chunk of their salaries skimmed off by corrupt officials long before it ever reached them. The camp itself was a complete disaster. There were no healthcare facilities. There were no markets, no shops nearby. The women had to walk over 10 miles just to buy basics like cooking oil. And what went for a school was just a derelict building with a few branches on the floor for desks. The one thing they did have, though, was children. Lots and lots and lots of children. So the first thing you ask yourself when you're confronted with this kind of situation is, where the hell do you start? After all, it was no good reintroducing animals as had been originally planned or giving these guys brand new guns. After all, there was a very good reason why there were so few animals left in the park. And when you're not paid and your kids are hungry, who can blame them? But what we did know was, unless we did something to help the people who were running the park, there was no way we would be able to confront the threats coming from outside. Now, the only trouble was the so-called project plan didn't really take into account this kind of situation. It's often much easier to focus on things like charismatic wildlife and anti-poaching strategy than it is complex humanitarian issues. And in all fairness, a lot of organizations are now beginning to realize that unless you work closely with the local communities, your conservation project has very little chance of success. But still, all too often, these plans that are drawn up in offices thousands of miles away in Europe or in North America are more about impressing donors or ticking administrative boxes than they are about dealing with these complex issues. And the truth is, it's not until you're actually on the ground dealing with those issues on a day-to-day basis can you really understand where you need to focus your efforts. So we decided that we would take the project plan and put it to one side and focus on what we could do to support the rangers and their families. So we opened up a tiny clinic where people could get basic treatment and some medicines, and then we opened up a food store. And we hired one of the rangers' wives to manage it. The first time any woman from the camp had ever had an employment contract. And we did what we could to support the school by buying some basic equipment and paying a few teachers' salaries. But most importantly, we gave the rangers some opportunities to earn money so they could feed their own families without some crook skimming off the top of it before it even reached them. Very simple things, as it turned out. And it took a while, but eventually things began to improve for the rangers and their families. People seemed healthier, they seemed better fed, There was a real sense of hope in the camp. Now, the only trouble was, now we had another problem. And the problem was, how were we going to report back to our headquarters, to the people who paid our salaries, about the improvements that had been made? After all, none of this had been in the original project plan, and there was nothing we could tell them about elephants. We would need to think of some other way to demonstrate the positive changes that had happened. Now, one of the things that impressed me the most when I first arrived in the park was the amount of graffiti. It was everywhere. Now, as any parent knows, one of our children's first creative acts is to grab hold of something and start scribbling all over the wall. The children of Lusinga were no exception. Every surface of every crumbling old building had been scrawled on by countless tiny hands clutching their pieces of charcoal. The only trouble was, there was something deeply disturbing about these images. These were not the innocent drawings of happy, carefree children. These drawings spoke of fear and violence and suffering. Images like this. But then, when you saw what these children faced every day of their lives, these images made total sense. Not only were they living under the impact of malnutrition and disease, but they were under constant threat of attack from marauding bands of insurgents who were fighting for control of the resources in and around the park. We hear a lot about the violence in the north and the east of the Congo, but actually that area around Pemba has, for many decades, been profoundly unsettled. In fact, it was something we found out ourselves firsthand after being attacked on 2 separate occasions by heavily armed rebels during the time we were there. But then, something changed. After we'd been working in the park for a few months, doing what we could do to improve people's lives, something amazing happened. It wasn't obvious at first, but then we noticed it. The graffiti was beginning to change. So instead of the scary heads and the knives and the guns, we started to see this. And this. And this. The kids were starting to draw the kinds of drawings you expect children to be drawing. And then my wife gave them some paper and colored crayons. Boy, there was no holding these guys back. So then it struck us, of course, these are the indicators. This is how we could show the positive progress that had been made. Why don't we put these in our reports? Well, as you probably know, organizations have their own traditional way of doing things. So you can imagine the initial response. You say the kids are doing what? They are drawing flowers and animals on the walls. Some kind of a joke, right? What about the bloody elephants? But then, even the most skeptical people came around. And the reason they came around was because something else amazing began to happen. For the first time in years, large animals were beginning to appear on the open savanna in the area around the park headquarters in broad daylight. Of course. If the rangers no longer needed to poach them to feed their families, the animals were going to come back. So sometimes we need to think about how we evaluate and measure things. We may think we're actually moving forward, when in fact we're standing still. And at other times we may think we're going nowhere, but we're actually moving forward. We need to look beyond the numbers and the statistics. Of course, they tell their own very important story. We still need to be counting elephants. But we need to make sure that we don't miss those other stories, those other really important stories that are being drawn upon the walls. Now, I know we hear a lot of negative news coming out of Africa these days about loss of wildlife and their habitat, and it's true. We are now at a major crossroads. Depending on how we act over the next few years, we may well be one of the last generations to ever see these magnificent creatures in the wild again. Now, it's a pretty depressing thought. But there is hope. And the hope is that the generation of young Africans who are now growing up will not fall victim to the self-interests and misguided policies of their forefathers. But that is why it is so important that we now, just like the children of Lusinga, expose them to new ideas, to give them hope, and to help them discover and explore the amazing natural world that they live in, and to watch what they're drawing on the walls. So the next time you walk in and you find that your children or your grandchildren have scribbled all over the newly painted dining room wall, before you get mad, just remember, this may merely be their way of trying to communicate to you something about the kind of world they would like to grow up in. Thank you.